fashion in contemporary capitalism is, for example, always caught between the demand for novelty, differentiation, emulation, and cheap mass production.
Why do people buy fast fashion? Does it fulfill some ancient innate desire lying dormant within us until an age where the industrial capacity finally emerged to meet this hunger for cheap, trendy, disposable clothing? Or are we tricked into it by cunning and manipulative advertisers? Maybe some combination of the two. It offers some genuine improvements over older types of fashion. It may also be more comfortable, more objectively aesthetic or attractive, more superficially egalitarian, more diverse, but also be imbued with Americana, sex appeal, or status by the larger workings of the fashion industry. Does advertising and social trends just confuse consumers about the true value of fashion? Or do they actually create new value in it if the ideas about the product increase the use value the consumer gets out of them, either because of their own or others' changed perceptions?
Is it shaped by a desire to emulate the rich? Is it the thrill of novelty produced by some neurological spark, hard-coded into us by some ancient evolutionary pressure in the distant past? Or the fear of missing out on some item only stocked for a few weeks? Do we consume it to show our personal identity and stand out, or to conform and fit in, or some synthesis of these two contradictory desires?
In this video, I'm going to compare two very different approaches to consumption of fast fashion, developed by different economic schools of thought. The first, inspired by neoclassical economics, shows a game being played by patient consumers, trying to wait for markdowns at season clearance sales, and suppliers, trying to ensure they are not forced to sell at a loss by these cunning consumers.
The second is the systems of provisioning approach developed by Ben Fine. This focuses on the role that producers and broader social pressures from consumer cultures play in shaping individual preferences. These schools of thought don't just answer the same question differently, they actually ask completely different questions about consumer behavior. These are not the only approaches to analyzing consumption from either heterodox or orthodox economics, but I think the comparison between them illustrates many important points of divergence between the two broader economic traditions, and more than that, hopefully sheds some light on understanding consumer behavior and how we consume fast fashion. So, neoclassical theories take consumers' desire for changing fashion trends to be innate. It doesn't ask where these tastes come from, it just takes them as a given. Then we add strategic consumers that wait patiently for season clearance sales to force retailers to lower their prices. Retailers respond to this by implementing fast fashion systems. I'm not examining a wide variety of neoclassical theories about consumption of fast fashion. I'm really just looking at the first paper I found on Google Scholar. But I do think this is a useful illustration of a number of core neoclassical ideas on consumption, interpreted in quite a flexible and context-specific way, and also can serve as a useful illustration for some of the common heterodox critiques of neoclassical consumer theory. A lot of my previous videos on consumer theory have focused on general equilibrium models. So general equilibrium models are models which focus on a large set of markets that are all interconnected, and it looks at how to find a set of prices for all the different goods so that all of the markets clear simultaneously. This price means that supply equals demand for every single market in that set. The issue with using this as a case study is that the assumptions you need to make to get all of the markets to balance out are often very rigid and very abstract, so you can't really adjust them to fit a real world situation. So instead, in this video, I'm going to be focusing on partial equilibrium analysis. That means just looking at one market in isolation. These models are often more flexible and can include many of the nuances of the real world. Here, we include imperfect information and strategic behavior. Both partial and general equilibrium models play a large role in neoclassical economics. They both come in a wide variety of forms and are constantly evolving, adapting, and becoming more complicated. So a critique of the simplest forms of these models is never going to extend to more current models. Both of these models come with a set of heterodox critiques. Further, while these models look unified on the outside, within neoclassical economics there is some degree of rivalry between them. Talking about this properly is really beyond the scope of this video. I just wanted to point out there's a slight shift in focus from my previous videos on consumer theory. So, what actually happens in this paper? How does the game play out? So, the game in this paper is a good deal more complicated than the ones I looked at in my previous video. I'm not going to look at all the lovely equations in the paper. I'm just going to summarize it narratively. Maybe that means I'm butchering it, but anyway. So, this game is played sequentially, with players taking turns one after the other. In each of their turns, a player is going to pick their best move, which will maximize their outcome given how they expect the other player to respond. So, in sequential games, it doesn't matter if there's a really nice payoff for one of the players down the line if that would require a move which they know that their opponent is never going to make. They're always going to base it only on the possibilities which their opponent will pick. So the game starts with firms designing products and building a rapid design to distribution system in order to keep up with trends. Firms have to weigh the additional cost of enhanced design with the likely increase in sales, ability to raise prices, and, importantly for this paper, with reducing strategic consumer behavior. Next, firms have to decide how much to stock and what prices to actually charge. There's a three-way trade-off here between raising prices, increasing sales volume, and decreasing the chance of strategic consumer behavior. And firms have to carefully balance these three against each other in order to maximize profits. After this, consumers start wandering in and out of the store, deciding whether or not to buy the product immediately or to wait for a sale. They obviously don't know how other consumers are going to act, and they don't know the stock levels of the shop, so the probability they assign to the item being available on sale is just guesswork. The firm can try and reduce the risk of overshooting demand. It can implement advanced logistics systems. It can track its inventory in real time. They can try and predict consumer demand levels using economics, machine learning, astrology, reading tea leaves. They can also have very elegant, sparse, minimalistic shop displays with only a few items on the actual shop floor. That way, consumers can't determine how much stock there actually is in the shop, and they get the impression that there's a very limited amount. But these threats that there's limited stock do have to be credible. Consumers know that even with advanced logistics systems, a fair amount of items do end up on sale. So these can reduce strategic consumer behavior, but they probably won't eliminate it. So do people actually shop strategically? Empirical evidence shows that there is a fraction of consumers which do behave strategically. But even they tend to misestimate how likely a good is to end up on sale, significantly either overestimating it or underestimating it. The results of this model show that when consumers are strategic, fast fashion strategies help shops increase profits, and they use this model to explain the rise of fast fashion. Now we're going to start to look at the systems of provisioning approach. This approach focuses on how dominant firms within industries tend to shape consumer culture, but they do so in ways which are contested by other social forces and by other systems of provisioning. So, for example, there's a conflict between messaging from the fast food system of provisioning and from the health and wellness system of provisioning. And this conflict plays out in an environment which is shaped by gender norms, by housing and transport markets, and by a whole bunch of other social forces. There's a lot of different inspirations for the systems of provisioning approach, and it draws a lot of different ideas together from quite a wide interdisciplinary perspective. It tries to kind of reconcile postmodern critiques with earlier heterodox economic theory. So its main influence is probably a Marxist economics one, but there's a lot of other stuff in there. This means focusing a lot on how systems of capital accumulation and production shape consumption, even if consumers aren't directly aware that these are the forces shaping their consumption, because it's quite opaque. Advertising is often used to give quite a misleading idea of production, either these quaint cottage industries or eco-friendly futurism. It can also give misleading ideas about where things are produced, either trying to evoke a sense of nationalism or with marketing linking the product to very glamorous locations. If we go back to the prehistory of jeans, we get this environment which is shaped for them. We have this cotton industry shaped by slavery and colonialism. We have the Industrial Revolution and really cheap textile production. And we have this large workforce buying clothing. While wearing denim pants were nothing new to this, but jeans get kind of formally created in the 1870s by Levi Strauss when he adds a bunch of metal rivets to these. This increases how long they last, and so it makes them ideal workwear. Over the 20th century, they've evolved from being men's workwear to becoming a subversive form of dress for both men and women, to becoming just so ubiquitous that they've lost all of their association with class, they've lost a lot of their association with being rebellious or part of a counterculture, and they've lost a lot of the Americanness they started off with and just become thought of as ubiquitous or normal. Certain subcategories of genes might still carry meaning, but genes in general just don't anymore. Now, consumer markets are largely concentrated in the global north, though there are very large growing markets in China and India, and there's a huge second-hand market throughout the developing world. Production is diffused globally in really long chain. The Made in China label on most jeans tells a very small part of the story. The cotton's produced in a different place. Design happens in a different place. A lot of the little subcomponents, the zips and the buttons, are produced somewhere else. Cotton from many different countries can be used in a single garment. Even a single thread can often have cotton fibers from different places. Cotton's grown all over, but it varies in quality. Only the long fibers that make the best quality cotton tend to be sold in regionally identifiable ways. Think of, for example, Egyptian cotton. But jeans don't require this. They only require the shorter fiber, lower quality cotton. In the global north, cotton farming tends to happen in a very mechanized way and is often subsidized. In the global south, it's very labor intensive and often quite exploitative. There's a lot of farmers in debt traps, there can be child labor, there's often not sufficient protective equipment when spraying pesticides. There's also environmental concerns with the amount of pesticides used in cotton production and the amount of water used in cotton production. Processing cotton into cloth means spinning all the fibers into threads and then weaving it and then dyeing it. This again happens all over. Also, sometimes countries that are lower on the value chain will process the lower quality cotton, and even if they grow higher quality cotton, will send the longer fibers away elsewhere for processing. They'll only locally process the lower quality fibers. The dyeing again involves a lot of harsh chemicals and a lot of water. Again, there's not always sufficient protective equipment. Also, to give jeans a worn look, the material is often bleached or stonewashed, which more chemicals, more water. So sewing and assembly is dominated by China, but can happen all over. Often fast fashion means production has to happen close to final markets. So, for example, a lot of manufacturing happens in Mexico, close to US markets. This production happens in large factories with lots of division of labor. So each person is responsible for just sewing one type of seam, for example. Although the large feminized workforce employed in these industries can be marketed as reducing patriarchal norms in developing countries, these jobs have such poor conditions and low pay, as well as rigid systems of labor control, that they're not really liberating anyone. Instead, they shift patriarchal control from households to factories. A proper discussion of this is really beyond the scope of this video. But although markets tend to normalize labor conditions across different countries and force a race to the bottom in terms of working conditions and wages, some countries have managed to build competitive sectors with slightly higher wages and working conditions, so there is some room for improvement while remaining competitive. Finally, the jeans are distributed through a wide collection of different stores. There's high-end brand name retailers, supermarkets which force prices as low as possible and have own brands, internet retailers with huge catalogs, and companies which specifically focus on the fast fashion aspect and push speed up as much as possible. So in conclusion, the two different schools of thought approach consumer theory very differently. The neoclassical approach focuses on rational consumers with predefined preferences, whereas the systems of provisioning approach looks at wider societal influences on consumer behavior. Both schools of thought can provide useful insights to understanding consumption. I prefer the systems of provisioning one because I think that the neoclassical approach tends to trade in a wider social, historical perspective for a very narrow focus on micro foundations and mathematical derivations.